This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On June the 18th, our final military history night of the 2023-2024 season took place. Our speaker was U.S. Navy retired Captain John Rodgaard of the 1805 Society, and his topic was North Americans in Nelson's Navy.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's Military History Night. I'm the event chair, James Ellis.
Silence in the ranks!
Well, happy Pride Month, everyone, and I hope you're all enjoying the glorious summer weather. It is welcome, I think, to all. Tonight's speaker served 41 years in the US Navy, including 12 years as a petty officer and 29 years of commissioned service as a naval intelligence officer. He was a contributor to the Discovery Channel's Unsolved History television programs, featuring in the episodes The Death of the USS Arizona, Inside Hitler's Bunker, and The Unsolved History of Pearl Harbor Midget Submarines. His work on the Japanese midget submarines was showcased on PBS Nova science series Killer Submarines of Pearl Harbor in 2011. He has written and co-authored multiple books and was the recipient of the Naval Institute's History Author of the Year Award in 1999. His book, From Across the Sea, North Americans in Nelson's Navy, will be the subject of tonight's presentation, and copies of which will be available for purchase afterwards. He is the chairman of the 1805 Club, and together with his wife Judy Pearson, PhD, is the co-editor of the 1805 Club's annual The Trafalgar Chronicle. Please give a warm welcome to John Rodgaard.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, James, for the introduction. On behalf of my co-author and editor, Dr. Sean Hoovel of Christopher Newport University, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you tonight about, I would say for both of us, a love to put this together for you. If I may, a little bit of, I hope I've got this right, a little bit of a promotion. As James mentioned, I am the current chairman of the 1805 Club. I'm the current chairman of the 1805 Club, and it is an association of enthusiasts and scholars of the Georgian maritime era, 1714 and 1837. Now, that maritime era, which I'm sure many of you know, was a time of discovery and revolution and global war. The aim of our club is to inspire greater understanding of the achievements of the period, promote the legacy of the world's sailing navies to the modern seafaring age, the 21st century. How is this done on our part? Well, first, we conduct commemorative events. In fact, I think the next one will be here in the States, down in Alexandria, Virginia, which members of the club will have the Battle of the Nile commemoration. Back in the UK, in October, will be the Battle of Trafalgar at HMS Nelson's wardroom in Portsmouth. Hopefully, William will be able to be there. In addition, we deal with conservation. The club has been around since 1991, and we've been involved with conserving men in memorials, such as graves, in the UK, but also in other places. I mentioned to James, a grave of a U.S. Navy midshipman in Bermuda, at St. Peter's Church in St. George's. We've done many of those aspects, and my most recent is that we're in a process, we've commissioned the Borthwick Institute of York University in which they are conserving the St. John's Fig Tree Parish Register, 1729, 1825, on the island of Nevis. They're in the process of conserving it, and we will be returning that incredible document to the islanders sometime within the next 6 months. Oh, by the way, it has Nelson and Nesbitt's signature, their wedding signature, because they were married on the 11th of March, 1787, on the island of Nevis. Additionally, we're involved with education outreach from the standpoint not only in the UK, but globally. We are a global organization. We are currently, we are a charitable incorporated organization under English and Welsh law, but we are international. We have members ranging from, when you think about all the Commonwealth, as well as 30% are from the United States. Hard to believe, but true. When you put it all together, 40% of the membership are outside of the United Kingdom. So we're involved with educational outreach, going to schools, especially in the UK. We're involved with publications. We have 3 major publications. The first one is the Kedge Anchor, which is a biannual magazine that comes out. And I believe, Ron, did you see your latest Kedge Anchor? By the way, ladies and gentlemen, we have 4, and prospectively 2 more members of the 1805 Club. Girth, I'll mention you, of the 1805 Club. We have, as I mentioned, 2 bi-yearly magazines, the Kedge Anchor. We also have a month, it's every other month, so we're talking about six times a year, a digital newsletter called the 1805 Dispatches. And then our flagship periodical is the journal, our annual journal, the 1805 Club sponsored the Trafalgar Journal, which I'm happy to say that our principal editor is a certain lady named Judith Pearson, my wife, and I kind of strap on with her on that. And this journal is a peer review journal that comes out each year as part of one's membership. So I just let you know, Girth, that as a member, you'll get this. Anyway, we're also involved with a great deal of research. And for example, next year, the 1805 Club has sponsored 2 3-person panelists. These are scholars of the period. And like I said in the past, we have sponsored that at the United States Naval Academy's biannual McMullen Naval History Symposium at Annapolis, Maryland, which is the largest naval history conference in the world and probably the most prestigious. So we provide sponsorship to those scholars. So, all right, enough of that. What about the book, From Across the Sea? Well, we found inspiration for this book in the book Nelson's Band of Brothers, Men and Memorials, which was sponsored by the 1805 Club. The author and fellow 1805 Club member, Captain Peter Hoare, which some of you may know, is a noted naval historian, had solicited the support of several distinguished naval historians, some descendants of Royal Navy officers of the period, and members of the 1805 Club, to write biographies of those officers who were contemporaries of Nelson, his captains that fought with him at the Nile, Copenhagen, and Trafalgar. Sean and I took the same approach, and we were fortunate to obtain scholastic excellence of renowned naval historians such as Dr. John Hattendorf of the Naval War College, who was a member of the 1805 Club, who wrote about the Brenton family of Rhode Island, and Admiral of the Fleet, James, 1st Baron Gambier, who, by the way, was one of Newfoundland's royal governors just before 1805. Gambier of the Bahamas. As Rear Admiral Joseph Callow, United States Navy retired, who was written extensively on Lord Nelson, said in his book's introduction, our book, that this book, From Across the Sea, is a story of an extraordinary group of seamen who served in the Royal Navy during the period encompassed by Nelson's time of service and beyond. Through the years beyond the great Anglo-French global wars of 1793 and 1815. Several of the men highlighted in this book, From Across the Sea, had direct interaction with Nelson. Some were Nelson's band of brothers, as Captain Hores identified in his book. Others might have been associated with Nelson, serving aboard his ships, assigned to Nelson's squadrons. Regardless, all would have known the man through his exploits and reputation. So, ladies and gentlemen, who were these men? Well, first of all, they were all British subjects. Having been born prior to the American War for Independence, they were from New Englanders, the Middle Atlantic colonies, Nova Scotia, the Maritime Provinces, Bahamas, Bermuda, Jamaica, starting to sound like a song. The Windward and Leeward Islands. They all served under the red, white, and blue ensigns of the Royal Navy. Oops, sorry. Now, for those who were born in the former American colonies, the 13, that now comprised the United States, they were the losers. Thousands of Loyalist families fled to Canada, which, oh, by the way, I think there was over 100,000 came to Canada. The legacy that those individuals made and their families on Canada, I think, cannot be overstated, in my opinion. Now, they fled to Canada, they fled to the Caribbean, they fled back to UK. And for several of the men, they had fathers, grandfathers who were middle or senior crown officials in colonial governments or officers of the Royal Navy or the British Army. And even though these men came from such families, many had no recourse but to enter naval service or the Army, as their families were broke, having lost everything. Many of these North Americans from Loyalist families went into the Royal Navy and were able to advance through the ranks due to widespread use of patronage. Many were advanced by senior officers of the Royal Navy. One such American was Admiral Sir John Wentworth Loring, who was my co-editor and author's ancestor. Loring enjoyed the backing of such admirals as Lord Hood, Hyde Parker. However, Loring's rise through the Royal Navy was attributable to performance. You had patronage, you had performance. Performance could be seen in two broad, interrelated categories. One, Loring and others became masters in their sailing technology of the era, or at least competent enough. And the second was performance under the stress of combat. Dr. John Hattendorf wrote about 3 generations of Brenton family of Rhode Island, who served in the Royal Navy prior to the American War for Independence, through the great Anglo-French Wars of 93 to 1815, as socially prominent Royalist family from colonial Rhode Island. Professor Hattendorf found 2 recurring themes across the generations: a devotion to public service in holding government positions, naval combat service, and charitable activities. 3, actually. The second was noted religious faith that through the senior ranks in the Navy formalized the introduction of chaplains into the fleet. He also wrote about Admiral of the Fleet James 1st Baron Gambier of the Bahamas. He was a very successful fighting captain who rose very quickly to positions of high command, and through his responsibility to the fleet, had enormous influence that would last for decades. This past weekend, Judy and I spent our weekend in Montreal, and we were with our Canadian secretary, and who is originally from Newfoundland. And we've been discussing, and he knows all about Gambier. And we've been discussing a potential project. We talked about memorials, of working with the local historical centers in St. John's to erect a commemorative plaque of Lord Gambier as Governor General of Newfoundland prior to 1805. So hopefully we'll be able to do this. Now, for another man coming from a loyalist family, patronage and performance did not necessarily take him to the highest ranks of the Royal Navy. This can be seen with Lieutenant William Pringle Green of Halifax, Nova Scotia. Contributor and fellow 1805 Club member Jeremy Utt, who was a high school teacher in Virginia, wrote the following, quote, "History often provides examples of people, despite dedicated service to a nation, do not receive all the recognition they deserve," end of quote. For his performance during Trafalgar, Green was promoted to lieutenant at 24 years of age. Despite his post-Trafalgar endeavors, Green would remain a lieutenant for the next 40 years. As lieutenant, he did command at sea, and he also was responsible for inventions that improved the rigging of ships, as well as developing training manuals in the use of shipboard small arms, as well as the big great guns. He commanded a sloop of war out of Nova Scotia during the War of 1812. Now, he also received 2 silver medals for his inventions from the Royal Society for Encouragement of Arts, Manufacture, and Commerce. As a possible reason for this extremely talented man not being able to reach higher rank may be due to his public criticism of the performance of several of Nelson's captains at Trafalgar. He openly wrote that a few of them didn't exactly, rush to the guns. Now, as you can imagine, this wasn't on the good side of Lord Collingwood. Writing in 1812, Green stated the following, that if the officers done their duty in every ship, the whole of the enemy would have been taken or destroyed. And as I said, Collingwood was not pleased. Now, we can't forget about the men from this part of the world that were pressed into service. As Dr. Christopher Magra of the University of Tennessee wrote in the book, that, quote, "The American perception of impressment was an exceptional one." He examined the American perspective from an economic one. American mariners saw impressment as sharply curtailing their occupational mobility. In the early part of the 18th century, it was British maritime law that British Americans going to sea in the merchant world were not to be impressed. The percentage of British Americans, and we'll include Canadians after the 7-Year War, represents something like 35% of all the merchant seamen flying the Red Ensign. So as you can imagine, from the standpoint of trade, these individuals were worth their weight in gold and not to be impressed. However, things did change. Most of it was obviously the American War. Now, Captain Peter Hoare contributed to our book. In his chapter, North Americans at Trafalgar, he reveals the extent of impressment by analyzing the Ashford-Trafalgar Roll, which, oh, by the way, is available on the 1805 Club website. So if you go to the 1805 Club website, you can go to the Trafalgar Roll and look up individuals from the individual ships that fought at Trafalgar. And from the ATR, the Ashford-Trafalgar Roll, there are over 21,000 names. And Hoare assessed that if the ATR can be representative of the Royal Navy in 1805, there were at the time 360 Canadians and 3,200 Americans in the Royal Navy as a whole, and that between 20 and 45% were pressed. However, he concludes there is so much more work that needs to be done to determine who were pressed and who became volunteers. If any of you know about the volunteering aspect of it, James, I have £5. Now, you can take that to volunteer or we'll press you. So, coming out of your pub and being given that ultimatum, what would you do? £5 for head money. A little different, William, that you're going to be going through. Okay? All right. So, how many of them were U.S. citizens is really pretty hard to tell. But for example, there would be someone on the Roll of Victory, and his name, nationality, American. See, this is just too recent from the American War of Independence and independent United States. Might be lucky. Ron, you're from New York. Okay, well that gives me an idea. You're probably a Yank. But it doesn't mean you're a U.S. citizen, because if you were born before the American War, you're a British subject. And guess what? You're also can be pressed into service. There you go. Yeah, but you would have taken your £5, mate.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Now, from another aspect of pressed Americans, Matthew Brinkley, he's the former historian of the USS Constitution Museum, provided 2 biographies of North Americans. One was from Massachusetts and another one from New York, who were pressed into the Royal Navy, but were able to return to the U.S. and enlisted into the U.S. Navy aboard the Constitution during the War of 1812. These men were skilled seamen who learned the profession not only as merchantmen, but also in the Royal Navy. As with many North Americans who served in the Royal Navy during this period. As I mentioned, oops, let's see, where are we? Yeah, here we are. I think I just got ahead of myself. Oh, yes. Now, Sean and I approached the structure of the book based on the book A Band of Brothers, and we divided the biographies by geographic region in North America, where Captain Hoare divided his book into the 3 great battles. And as with Hoare, we preceded our biographical background with major articles that set the tone for the book. Dr. Andrew Lambert, which I'm sure many of you know, wrote about the North America of 1793 through 1815 and places the North American experience of the great Napoleonic or French Revolutionary Wars, the Napoleonic Wars, into context. Then there was the Anglo-American relationship, 1815 to 1837, which I wrote. This shows the level of contempt to the British for the Chesapeake incident There you can see the Chesapeake at the top. Hostility towards the Royal Navy during the War of 1812. Respect for the Royal Navy, as seen through Commodore John Barry's description in The Creation of the United States Navy. Quote from John Barry: admiration for the Royal Navy as an organization through the experiences of the U.S. Navy's Mediterranean Squadron is paramount. Cooperation between both navies, putting down, you can see the Barbary pirates. During the time that we introduced our squadron with Preble, actually it was another squadron prior to that, our logistics support was coming out of Gibraltar. So it wasn't necessarily altruistic. After all, Britain was fighting France. And of course, Britain was paying tribute to the Barbary pirates. But having our little navy go up against the Barbary pirates was worth its weight in gold. Also, we could see, as I say, contempt. There's the battle between Chesapeake and, I just forgot her name. Shannon, thank you. Of course, I should know. Between Shannon and Chesapeake, which only lasted about 20 minutes. Also, after the Napoleonic Wars, we reintroduced our squadrons into the Mediterranean. During the 1820s, we are now seeing, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, this may seem familiar, James, as we were talking about, we have the Greeks trying to overthrow Turkish oppression. During that same time, with the Greek Revolution, Greek piracy throughout the Eastern Mediterranean was rampant. The Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy cooperated with one another to suppress Greek piracy to ensure commerce would flow out of Turkey, out of the Middle East, back to our respective countries. That was not necessarily the first time. How many of you know about the Quasi-War, 1798? This was when the French Republic declared war against the nascent United States. Mostly it was fought in the Caribbean. The U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy escorted each other's ships, exchanged signal books, and provided logistics, the British did, to our nascent flotillas in the Caribbean to suppress the French. So here we are, less than a decade or a decade after our American War for Independence. The U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy are cooperating against a common opponent. In this case, it was the French. Now, as I mentioned, we approached the structure of the book based on the Band of Brothers, and I said we divided into those categories. Now, I ran across a fascinating biography. It was a young Royal Navy lieutenant out of Nova Scotia, out of the North American station, who obtained leave from his Commodore to go to the United States for a 1 month's leave. Now, it wasn't just for a holiday routine. He was carrying dispatches. And he and a Royal Marine major left Nova Scotia, arrived in Boston, handed over papers to the British legation in Boston. Oh, by the way, toward the Charleston Naval Yard. Now, I give this a little thought here. Interacted with the Bostonians, who he found absolutely fascinating, who seemed to be more English than English. Sailed down to New York, interacted with the citizens of New York City, had a nice tour of the New York Navy Yard, handed over dispatches to the legation in New York, then took a steamboat, actually crossed over from New Jersey down to Philadelphia, and also presented documents to the legation, as well as having a free tour of the Philadelphia Navy Yard, which was the heart of the United States Navy. Then took a steamboat down from Philadelphia through the canal that separates the Delmarva Peninsula into the Chesapeake Bay, arrived in Baltimore, then went down to Washington, D.C., and then handed diplomatic papers to the head of the British legation there in Washington, D.C., and toured the Washington Navy Yard. Oh, by the way, confronted by one U.S. Marine who said, "Pass, sir." Now, he also had an opportunity to engage, as I said, culturally with all the Americans. And it was fascinating to read his description of how he felt about Americans. He confronted the stereotype that Britons had at the time. They were a bunch of bumpkins. Of course, he didn't go further west than Washington, D.C., but the fact is that he interacted with, and you could imagine to this day, we Americans just love someone with a British accent. So you can imagine all the belles of Washington just huddled around this young and dashing officer, together with this Royal Marine major. He found them absolutely enticing. He thought American women were just, wow, they're so open, conversational, so liberated. But what's fascinating, his report back on his intelligence operation to all of our Navy yards. And his quote is this: "They build marvelous ships, overgunned, but marvelous just the same. But it's a pity they can't maintain them." He was shocked to see the USS Ohio in ordinary in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, rotting away for the lack of any covering over her. He was just beside himself. He couldn't believe how negligent we were. But he did admire our ships. The quote is, "Americans build wonderful ships, but why don't they maintain them properly?" Gee, I think I'm getting a little bit of a current thing that's going on right now, because our Navy is challenged with regard to maintaining our ships. We're way behind in bringing our ships back up to speed. We have been worn and torn over the last 20 years, and we're facing a pretty significant shortfall. Whoops. Oh, sorry, too fast. Now, in the book's epilogue, Dr. Judith Pearson postulates that many of the men who were profiled in this book had crossed paths with one another. She cross-checked each profile and saw correspondence with not only family connections, patronage, battles, ships, and of course Nelson, and Trafalgar. Judy did a hell of a job. Sorry, that was a kudo to someone in the audience. Whoops. Oh, sorry, back one. Now, with this book, we had a real major challenge. We had to cut 8 biographies from the manuscript, as we greatly exceeded the number of words. We had to cut 50,000 words from the book. Now, the good news, the previous editor of the 1805 Club's annual, the Trafalgar Chronicle, seen here, picked up all the biographies that would have been left on the cutting room floor. These include the biographies of such Canadians as Admiral George Westhoff, Admiral Philip Westhoff, Admiral of the Fleet William Barry Wallace, and Admiral Sir Manley Dixon. The biographies of Rear Admiral Thomas Tucker of Bermuda and Captain William Rutherford of North Carolina were also left, but in this book. And as you can see, oops. Let's see, I could link it to that and you could see, you could purchase the Trafalgar Chronicle, this edition, if you wish. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity. I hope not too many of you fell asleep after supper. I don't blame you. But again, I do want to thank you on behalf of my co-editor and publisher and writer for allowing me to be with you tonight. And I'm happy to take questions at this time. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Questions, comments, throwing bread rolls? Yes, Garth.
I wouldn't throw a bread roll because that's dangerous to you.
Yeah, especially with my gimpy leg.
I remember reading about the approximate number of Americans that served aboard the Victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. Is there any? I realize there's very little documentation regarding the actual seamen. Were most of them? Correct me if I'm wrong. Were most of them pressed? What was their feeling about suddenly being on board the Royal Navy after the American War of Independence?
Well, as you can imagine, it's much more complicated. I can say, refer to our website. There's the Ashford Trafalgar Roll, and you literally can go through it. Okay, and you can pick it up. And as I mentioned with Peter Hoare, at the time there were 320 certified Americans who were at Trafalgar. I'm sorry, I forget the number. Certainly a significant number of Canadians. Okay. Now, being pressed or volunteering, as I mentioned earlier, to James, or also to Ron, about having your option of receiving £5 or getting a knock on the head, right. There's been some recent work over the last, I would say, 6 years. And I wish I could remember the gentleman's name. He provided a fabulous talk at the McMullen Naval History Symposium. I think that was 6 years ago, in which he, and oh, by the way, the Americans in the audience at the Naval Academy, boy, did that get their attention, because they were really, in fact, Judy helped me out. I think some of them were a little upset because he busted the myth on American impressment, that the percentages of Americans serving on Royal Navy ships were not impressed at all. Now, of course, that gets back to the little fine line of getting your £5. But the percentage of, I'll put it this way, the reason that we declared war on the United Kingdom today, June 18th, 1812, we declared war. And one of the reasons, the primary reason, was the impressment of our seamen and our neutral rights to conduct commerce on the high seas. Which, oh, by the way, at the Treaty of Ghent, those two reasons for why we declared war against Britain were never in the treaty. In fact, that continued to be an open source of, we'll say, discussion up through 1914, when Britain instituted the blockade on Germany and start stopping neutral ships, aka U.S. ships. So that whole issue, the two big issues in which we declared war against Britain and against you, was never resolved. And oh, by the way, we lost that war. I don't care what everyone says, but we lost that war. Yes, sir. I don't know if I answered that, but it's much more entailed. And I will get back with you with the gentleman who wrote the paper on that, because it's really a piece of work. He went ahead, he was able to digitize the ship's rolls of all the Royal Navy ships between 1793 and 1801. and got the background information on who joined and where they came from and why. And it's a phenomenal piece of work. Sir?
I thank you for your most interesting presentation.
Well, thank you.
I too am most interested in naval history of that era. But I wonder if you would be aware of a genuine piece of naval history that lies in a park named, strangely enough, Anchor Park, about an hour straight north of here.
Ah,
It's a gigantic kedge anchor. It's mounted up and with plaques and stuff explaining it. But
I
the
believe
story
I
goes-
saw a road marker as we drove down from Montreal, and it was something about an Anchor Park.
Yes, well,
Hmm?
story goes, 1812, these people are lugging this kedge anchor up from Toronto towards the shipyard in Collingwood. And they find that the war is over. And they decided that they had enough of this hauling this kedge anchor, they just left it there.
In the Nottawaga River.
Pardon me?
In the Nottawaga.
No, not at all. But anyway,
I was going to say how Canadian of them, but go
well,
ahead.
there you go. But I thought you might be interested in another relic that's being preserved of the time that you're interested in.
Well, it's fascinating. Thank you, sir. Do you know where where did the kedge anchor come from?
Came from Toronto.
Well, right.
Other than that, I don't.
It wasn't forged in Toronto, I don't think, at the time. In New York, I might add, right? It was
It
New
came
York.
from
Okay.
Ontario.
Fascinating. Any other comments, any questions? Sir? Yes, sir.
Just wondering, were there black sailors in the British Navy at the time?
Yes.
Flogger? How many? Any idea?
Number-wise, it's really fuzzy, okay, that I can tell you. They were not identified by race that I'm aware of. So, for example, you could have had Samuel Jones from Virginia. Okay? You could have had John Smith from Nova Scotia. And they could have been volunteers. Most likely could have been volunteers.
From the Caribbean?
Also, during both the American War as well as the War of 1812, the British deliberately raised, in fact, especially during the War of 1812, 2 battalions of colonial Marines. What is interesting, and I've been told this by a scholar, which I know we have to go into more. He's a former. He writes history on the U.S. Marine Corps. The British didn't identify them as Negro. They identified them from coming from Poland. Yes, I know. Yeah. 2 battalions of Colonial Marines were raised. In fact, go on the web and you'll see Colonial Marines of 1812. You'll see their uniforms, everything about them. They served during the period of time. They eventually were sent, one battalion was sent down, I forget what island in the Caribbean. Another one went to, up to Nova Scotia. And subsequently, many of them went to West Africa, to Sierra Leone. But yes, from a Marine standpoint, definitely, and also from the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy at the time was an international navy. There were French at Trafalgar on the British side. There were Danes, there were Swedes, there were Dutch, and there were former American colonials, Canadians, the Islanders. The Royal Navy was truly an international navy. Italians, Spanish even. So, yeah. Did I answer your question?
I do believe so.
There's a lot there. Believe me, there's a lot more though to dig into it. But as I mentioned, race was not placed in there. Anyone else? Dr. Pearson.
Well, you might want to speak briefly about Jack Perkins.
Oh yes, I forgot. One of the gentlemen in the book, and it's fascinating. His name was John Perkins. His mother was a slave, his father was white, born in Jamaica. As a young man, he was placed into apprenticeship to a carpenter in Jamaica, a white man, who subsequently joined the Royal Navy as a carpenter, and John Perkins became a carpenter's mate. During the course of his time, he became a very efficient pilot of Jamaican waters. And outside of a bit of a screw-up, he inadvertently ran a Royal Navy ship aground outside of Jamaica. He was kind of furloughed for a period of time, and this was during the 7 Years' War. But he comes back, and the Royal Governor, as well as the Admiral on the Jamaica station, really take a shine to this young man. And during the course of the American War for Independence, with the outbreak of the Anglo-French Wars, he rises up through the ranks and becomes a post-captain in the Royal Navy. During the course of his service, he retires in 1812. He had a very bad case of, would have been close to tuberculosis, but he had to retire. He, during his service, captured 300 ships. His prize money, as you can imagine, was phenomenal. He was also, because of being black, fluent in French, fluent in Spanish, was used as an intelligence agent into Cuba as well as into the Isle of Hispaniola, Haiti, and was involved in determining what was going on with the rebellion in Haiti. As you can imagine, the white planters back in Jamaica took a kind of a sconce to him because they thought he was, how can I say, very, very attuned to the rebellion going on in Haiti. And of course, they were fearful of uprisings in Jamaica. And as well, oh, by the way, so were the southern planters in the United States, what was going on in Haiti. But that didn't deter him. During the War of 1812, he had success. He commanded a 32-gun frigate and was promoted as a post-captain in the Royal Navy. Was that an exception? Yes, it was. An incredible exception. John Jack Punch Perkins, because his first command was a tender to a frigate named Punch. And that's where his exploits. I mean, this is something out of, Pirates of the Caribbean, for God's sakes. This man, I mean, if a movie could be made about this guy, I'm telling you, it should be. This guy was incredible. Anyway, he dies in 1812. He is very prominent in Jamaican society. He was befriended by the wife of the royal governor there. Very good friends of the governor there in Jamaica. He was very much attuned in Jamaican society, the planters' society. In fact, he had his own plantation. In his will, he had 26 slaves. So that's another individual that is in our book. Thank you, Judy, for mentioning Jack Perkins. A remarkable officer in the Royal Navy, incredibly talented. I have to say, as a half Dane, his only defeat came going against the Danish frigate in the Caribbean. He couldn't capture the Dane. In fact, the painting is in the Royal Danish Maritime Museum showing Perkins losing this battle against this Danish ship. I thought that was pretty cool. But anyway. Thank you, Judy. Any other questions or comments? Sir,
What's
Garth.
your next project? Is there another book in the works?
Well, funny you should mention it.
Permits you?
Judy, can you go over there?
Is the manuscript there?
Tail ships.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, look. Well, can you bring it here so they can see? All right. This book came out in December, just before Christmas. It's titled Tail Ships, The Hunt for Soviet Submarines in the Mediterranean, 1970-73. Oh, by the way, my rack was right there on that ship. I slept right, not outside, but inside the skin of the hull. And it's, I'll be told that nothing else has been written about this period in the Mediterranean during the high point of the Cold War, at sea of the Cold War period. So, but also I've come out with, in fact, for those who were with us back in 2020, a hard-fought ship, the story of HMS Venomous. A commemorative edition comes out at the end of this month. It's coming out by Seaforth Publishing, which is a big deal. And it's a commemorative edition because my two dear friends who are so, Lieutenant Commander Robert Moore, who was the commanding officer training ship Venomous, had written a monograph about the ship, had showed me this monograph. I thought it was going to be incredible. He was going to write an edition, a full-length edition on the book, in which he had something like 40 pounds of material. But unfortunately, he died much too prematurely. And his publisher, who was, his father was the last engineering officer of Venomous, published that edition, but also, unfortunately, a year and a half ago, Bill died back in St. Albans. So I came forth to Bill's widow and asked, I would like to be able to publish this book to commemorate these two men. And sure enough, she said yes. And the book is going to be hitting the streets the end of the month. And I believe an earlier copy is here in the library. It's titled A Hard-Fought Ship, The Story of HMS Venomous, who I only found recently, thanks to Mark Billings, our Canadian secretary, who's from Newfoundland, that the ship's crest, HMS Venomous, is in the Crow's Nest Club in St. John's. And which, oh, by the way, in my research, we weren't sure if that ship made it to St. John's, but apparently she did. So I'm over the moon on that one. So anyway, yes, to answer your question, Garth, I'm sorry. But there is another thing that we are working on. 2024 represents the 33rd year, July 4th, of the commissioning of the USS Arleigh Burke, the first ship of the great Arleigh Burke class destroyers. And Seaforth Publishing is considering myself, as well as my dear friend Peter Sue, who is the principal architect of the Arleigh Burke, to produce a commemorative book on the Burke class destroyers. So really, that's kind of the next thing thinking about. Sorry, that was a long one. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, if there's nothing else, thank you again for how can I say, suffering this. I noticed not too many of you had the Jell-O head neck bob, so that's really great. Anyway, thank you so much.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.